I stepped outside to find my 2 oak trees gone, replaced by a pristine garden. The earth was freshly disturbed, tire tracks still visible. A crumpled note flapped in the wind. Emergency landscaping adjustment. Emergency. My trees were stolen, and it wasn't a coincidence. I knew who was behind this: Marissa Thorne, the HOA president, who'd been pushing for these trees to be removed for months. But why take them in the dead of night? What was she trying to hide? As I stood there, a sick realization hit me. This wasn't just about trees. It was about something far darker. Marissa Thorne wasn't just the HOA president. She was the undisputed queen of Maple Crest Village. Always impeccably dressed, she had the kind of confidence that made you feel small without saying a word. Her power wasn't in the rules themselves, but in her ability to manipulate everyone into thinking she was right. She'd been eyeing my oak trees for months, making subtle comments about their unwelcome shade and how they distracted from the community's aesthetic. At first, I brushed it off until the fines started rolling in. The HOA board, like puppets on strings, followed her every move, never questioning her demands. I couldn't understand her obsession. These trees were part of the neighborhood's history, and yet to Marissa, they were an inconvenience, an eyesore she was determined to eradicate. But there was something else beneath her polished exterior, something I couldn't put my finger on. She smiled like she had it all figured out, but there was a coldness in her eyes, like she was always a step ahead, always in control. And when she stood there, arms crossed, watching me as if she knew something I didn't, I realized something. Marissa wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was hiding something. And those trees, they were just the beginning of her plan. I'd moved to Maple Crest Village a few years ago, looking for peace and quiet. The house was a bit older, but it had character, something I'd never found in a cookie-cutter suburban neighborhood. And the oak trees, they were a bonus. When I bought the house, they were a small part of the charm, but they quickly became a symbol of something more. I'd planted them with my dad when I was a kid. The trees grew as I did, their branches spreading wider, their trunks thickening, their roots digging deep into the earth. They were more than just trees. They were family, and when I inherited the house after Dad passed away, they were the only thing I had left of him. At first, life in the neighborhood was just as I'd imagined: quiet mornings, evening walks, the occasional HOA newsletter filled with mundane reminders about lawn care. But then there was Marissa Thorne. It started small, a complaint about the fallen leaves cluttering up her driveway. I laughed it off. Then came the warnings. "Your trees are blocking the view of the park," she said one afternoon, standing on my driveway, clipboard in hand with that knowing smile. When I didn't take her seriously, she escalated, using her power as HOA president to enforce fines for everything from overgrown branches to invasive roots. I tried to reason with her, even offered to trim back the branches, but she wouldn't hear it. "You're not understanding," she'd say, her voice too calm, too certain. "Those trees are a nuisance to the community." That's when I realized it wasn't about the trees. It was about control. She wanted to reshape the neighborhood in her image, and anything that didn't fit was a threat. She started showing up uninvited, talking about improving the landscape, and each time her words felt more like a demand than a suggestion. But the worst was yet to come. The HOA had been quietly collecting funds for a new neighborhood enhancement project. At first it sounded harmless, but now I was beginning to wonder if it was all just a cover for something darker. The day I discovered my oak trees were gone started like any other. I had just finished my morning coffee and stepped outside, only to stop dead in my tracks. The spot where my 2 mighty oaks had once stood was now a patch of bare earth. In their place, nothing but freshly dug soil and a scattering of decorative rocks. It didn't take long for the reality to hit me. The trees were gone. I walked toward the empty ground, trying to make sense of it. Tire marks led from the yard to the street, disappearing around the corner. A crumpled sheet of paper fluttered in the wind, pinned down by a small stone. Emergency landscaping adjustment. The words felt like a slap in the face. There was no way I was letting this slide. Marissa had crossed the line. I called the police, but they told me it was a civil matter, not criminal. I called the HOA office. No one was there. It was like no one cared. But I knew one thing for sure. Marissa had orchestrated this. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I immediately went inside, grabbed the camera I'd set up months ago after an incident with a porch pirate, and pointed it at the empty yard. The camera was old, but it had night vision and a decent enough resolution to catch anything that moved. For the next few days, I watched the footage hoping for some kind of clue. I combed through every angle, every frame, until I finally found it just past midnight. On the third night, a shadow appeared. It was too dark to make out any faces, but the figure moved with purpose, creeping around the side of my house, dragging something heavy behind them. The next morning, I checked the ground again. The soil was freshly disturbed. There were deep grooves in the dirt, like someone had used a heavy machine to scoop something out. The missing trees. It was clear now they had been stolen. But by whom and why, I didn't have to wait long for the answer. I found out from a neighbor that Marissa had hired a landscaping crew a few days before. They had spent hours in her backyard digging and hauling dirt. Something didn't sit right about it, especially after hearing that she'd been talking about transforming the area behind her house for a new garden. I needed more evidence. I reached out to a local arborist I knew, hoping he could confirm what I suspected, that my oak trees had been taken, and more importantly, that the theft was illegal. When he arrived, he brought his tools and a soil sample kit. As we stood near the spot where the trees once stood, he looked around, then crouched down to inspect the ground. "You're right," he said, running his fingers through the dirt. "This soil's been tampered with, and it looks like whoever did this wasn't just digging for fun." He pulled out a small tool and started scraping the bark of the remaining stumps. The drill marks were unmistakable, deep, precise holes that had been made with force. "Someone drilled into the base of the trees," he said, shaking his head. "That's not how you move a tree." I felt sick to my stomach. Who would do this? Who would take trees that had been there for decades, that were part of the neighborhood's identity? The arborist continued examining the ground, then paused. "It looks like something was buried here," he said, pointing to a small indentation near the stump. "We need to investigate further." I didn't have the tools to dig up the ground myself, but I had a new plan. I needed to go straight to the county. A few days later, I contacted the county's enforcement office, and they sent out an inspector. I showed him the video footage I'd captured. He squinted at the screen, pausing it at a frame where the figure's hood slipped slightly, revealing a patch of blonde hair. "That's strange," he muttered. "That cardigan, wait a minute, I know that cardigan." I didn't need to ask for confirmation. It was Marissa. She was the one in the video. My heart pounded. This wasn't just about stolen trees anymore. Marissa had gone to great lengths to cover up the crime. She'd hired a crew, disguised the theft as an emergency landscaping project, and thought she could get away with it. But now I had proof. And I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The inspector nodded, already pulling out his phone. "We'll be back," he said. "We'll handle this. You did the right thing." But I wasn't done yet. I needed to make sure this was exposed to the whole neighborhood. I printed out still frames from the video and slipped them into envelopes. I sent one to every member of the HOA board, the property manager, and the county. I even slipped one to a neighbor who was always filming everything, anything, to make sure this couldn't be swept under the rug. The worst part, I realized just how long Marissa had been getting away with this kind of manipulation. The HOA board, those complacent fools, had been letting her run the show, signing off on her projects without questioning a single thing. How many other emergency landscaping projects had been covered up in the past? How many times had she used the HOA's funds for her own benefit? I didn't have all the answers yet, but I was getting closer. And now, with the county involved, I was determined to see it through. No one was above the law, not even the president of the HOA. The day of reckoning finally arrived. The county officials had set the date to inspect the property and gather evidence, and it felt like the entire neighborhood had gathered to watch. Word had spread fast, and now people were whispering behind their windows, recording with their phones, waiting for the showdown to unfold. The county brought 2 inspectors, an arborist, and a deputy. They stood in front of my house, scanning the ground where the trees had once stood. Marissa was there too, of course, standing at the edge of the crowd with her arms crossed, trying to look calm, but the tension radiating off her was palpable. She knew what was coming. She'd had the nerve to smile at me as I passed, but I could see it in her eyes. She was terrified. The truth was about to come out, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The deputy stepped forward first, his voice loud and steady. "We're here today because of the serious allegations regarding the illegal removal of these protected oak trees. We've gathered evidence, and we're here to make sure justice is served." Marissa's face turned pale, but she quickly recovered, straightening up and crossing her arms even tighter. "What proof do you have?" she asked, her voice shaking just a little. The arborist stepped in, holding a thick folder with papers. "We have the footage," he said calmly. He handed the folder to the deputy, who opened it to reveal still images from the video I had taken. The crowd fell silent as the deputy showed the first frame Marissa in her signature cardigan, walking toward my yard under the cover of darkness, surrounded by the landscaping crew. The next frame showed her giving the signal standing behind the tree as it was loaded onto the truck. The proof was undeniable. Marissa's hands trembled as she glanced nervously at the neighbors. She cleared her throat. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed. "You can't just make accusations without a proper investigation." But the deputy wasn't fazed. "Ma'am, we've investigated. The footage, the drill marks, and the illegal removal of protected trees all point to you." As Marissa struggled to come up with a response, the neighbors began to murmur. The whispers grew louder, and soon someone from a few houses down called out, "We saw you. We saw you doing it." The atmosphere shifted. People had been afraid of her for so long, but now, with the evidence laid bare, they were turning on her. She was no longer the powerful HOA president. She was just a woman caught in her own lies. The arborist spoke up again, his voice firm. "This is not just about stolen trees. This is about the illegal use of HOA funds and the theft of protected land. You used money from the Landscape Improvement Fund to orchestrate this entire scheme, and we have the records to prove it." Marissa's face went red. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. The deputy turned to her, his expression cold. "Ma'am, we'll be issuing a fine of $52,000 for the damage caused, and you will also be required to replace the trees at your own expense." The crowd erupted into murmurs of disbelief and laughter. The HOA board members, who had been silent up until now, were visibly uncomfortable. One of them leaned into the other, whispering, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage had been done. Marissa tried to speak, but her voice was unsteady. This is a mistake," she stammered, but no one was buying it. The deputy reached into his jacket and pulled out a formal notice. "And as a result of your actions, your position as HOA president is officially revoked. You're no longer allowed to participate in HOA meetings or decisions." A heavy silence followed. It felt like the weight of the entire neighborhood was coming down on Marissa, and I couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. This was the moment I had been waiting for, when the truth finally came to light. As the deputy handed Marissa the notice of her removal, I saw the look on her face, a mixture of disbelief and pure rage. It wasn't just about the trees anymore. It was about her reputation, her power, and her grip on the neighborhood slipping away. "You've made a mess of things, Marissa," I said, stepping forward. "But at least now the rest of us can have some peace." Marissa opened her mouth to say something else, but the words never came. Instead, she turned and walked away, her shoulders stiff, her head held high, though the pride in her step had been replaced by defeat. The crowd broke into applause. People were filming, smiling, and for the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt like it was truly free. The aftermath of the showdown was more than I expected. For days, the air around Maple Crest Village was charged with a strange mix of relief and disbelief. The neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now smiled and waved as they passed by. The sense of tension that had hung over the neighborhood for so long was gone, like the weight of the world had been lifted off our shoulders. As for Marissa, well, she didn't take her downfall quietly. Word spread quickly about her removal from the HOA, and while she tried to maintain her cool, the cracks in her facade were becoming more and more apparent. I saw her standing at her mailbox one morning, staring at the notice from the county. The words $52,000 fine were bold, glaring at her from the paper. She tapped the notice, her finger trembling, as if willing the number to change. It didn't. She tried to act unaffected, but the look in her eyes said it all. She knew this was the end. And it was. For Marissa, the power she'd held for so long had evaporated in a matter of hours. The HOA now, without her iron grip, finally started to operate as it was meant to. A few new faces joined the board people who actually cared about the neighborhood, who didn't see it as a place to rule, but as a community to nurture. There were no more ridiculous fines, no more impossible standards, just a quiet, peaceful neighborhood again. As for me, I felt a sense of satisfaction I hadn't expected. The trees would never be the same. They'd been stolen, uprooted, and damaged. But the new oaks the county provided would grow strong. In time, they'd be just as beautiful, if not more so, than the ones that had been lost. The best part. The new trees would be a symbol, not just of resilience, but of the fight we'd all fought together. The entire process was exhausting, emotionally draining. I had spent weeks documenting everything, gathering proof, speaking with authorities, and dealing with Marissa's constant attempts to intimidate me. But as I stood in my yard, watching the new oaks take root, it felt worth it. The neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out began to stand taller. It was clear now that Marissa wasn't the powerhouse she'd thought herself to be. She was just a woman who'd abused her power and got caught. The HOA meetings were more relaxed, with people actually voicing their opinions. No one was scared of speaking their mind anymore. But there was something else too, a sense of justice, of karma. When the new trees were planted, I couldn't help but feel like I was honoring something bigger than just my father's memory. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. A week later, the same deputy who had helped expose Marissa's lies came by to check on the trees. He smiled when he saw how they were growing. "I think your dad would be proud," he said, his hand resting on one of the young oaks. And for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. There was still work to be done. The community had to rebuild its trust. But now it wasn't just me fighting alone. The entire neighborhood had learned a lesson. If you stand together, you can overcome even the most powerful of bullies. One last thing happened that gave me the closure I needed. The new HOA board members sent an email to the entire community, formally apologizing for the way things had been handled in the past. They promised transparency, fairness, and most importantly, respect for the property and rights of every resident. I couldn't help but smile when I saw it. The world might not always be fair, but sometimes justice does get served. And for the first time in a long time, Maple Crest Village felt like home.